Hello, welcome back. Today is actually our last lecture. I know, bittersweet. Our class is coming to an end. Not much more to do. Your artist timeline is due tonight. I look forward to seeing those and how you creatively interpret the project. Also, Monday we'll have the test. I'll give you a review guide this weekend. And Tuesday, your visual analysis paper is due. Be sure to read through all the instructions when you're doing that visual analysis. And there's also links to formatting with Chicago, but also, just kind of examples. If you take a look at the links, there's some examples of how to do a visual analysis paper, or, a good, successful example of a visual analysis paper. I'm looking forward to today's lecture. Two of my favorite things to talk about: modernism in architecture, aka mid-century modern, and also we're talking about conceptual and activism art. We didn't get as far this semester as I had hoped due to the duration, but we covered a fair amount. So this last test will be chapters 19, 21, and 22. I decided to make, since it's the last lecture, let's go ahead and just make today's lecture really good and also on the short side. So mid-century modern, also known as MCM today. MCM doesn't always stand for Man Crush Mondays. It can also be mid-century modern, which we know is very popular right now. If you watch any home renovation shows or house hunters show, mid-century modern, I'm a big fan of it, is very, very popular. But it really harkens to a particular time when architects were trying to do something innovative, but also very useful. So there's kind of this duality of practicality, but beautiful. In other words, a purity in architecture, something that you can use. We've talked about functionalism, but also something that is beautiful and is inspirational, right? A lot of times people think of mid-century modern architecture as always being sort of futuristic. But these architects were taking into consideration the most new materials and the best ways of using those materials to make a more livable, breathable space, right? And a great example of that is Frank Lloyd Wright. We talked about Frank Lloyd Wright early in his career with buildings such as Robie House in Chicago that was much more horizontal, the Prairie House style. He, had struggled in the 20s to get a lot of commissions. He did do the Imperial House and the Imperial Hotel in Japan that was inspired by Japanese architecture. He came to resent, ironically, a lot of the architecture that was inspired by his, that we nicknamed the international style. He came to resent it. He said it was too machine-like, but they were inspired by his earlier works. He favored instead an architecture that was very natural and organic. So even though it is very, in this case, rectilinear, this is Falling Water. A lot of people say this is his masterpiece. This is a triumph. In 1991, architecture group named this the best house design ever in the United States. So it's a very significant building. Made for Edgar J. Kaufman, who was in retail, and this was his kind of summer home. So a respite from Pittsburgh. They could travel here and kind of get away from the city. It's in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. This is on my bucket list. Do you all have a bucket list? Do you have a list of places that you have to go to? Do you have a list of art that you want to see now as a result of this class, or maybe as a result of World Art 1 or World Art 2? I hope you do have a bucket list. Those things keeps me going as a person. I want to keep seeing, visiting more countries, visiting more places, seeing art and architecture like this. This is on my list. I haven't seen it. How does Frank Lloyd Wright use new materials? Well, concrete is old. Concrete is been around since the Romans. The Romans used it in aqueducts. They had a way of making it quick dry so they could even do it underwater. They mixed things to make it lighter, like in the Pantheon 2,000 years ago. They're experimenting with concrete. But we now have ferro concrete, also known as reinforced concrete. if you've ever worked with cement before, or see workers, construction workers put it down, you might see where they put metal bars, iron bars, also known as rebar, inside of the wet cement, which forms into concrete, which reinforces it, it strengthens it. We also call that ferroconcrete. Well, it allows Frank Lloyd Wright to do this masterpiece with all of these jutting out cantilevers, remember that vocab word, that stretches out over open spans. It doesn't need traditional post and lintel construction, i.e. vertical supports underneath it. It's reinforced by horizontal struts, or in this case rebar, directly inside of the concrete to strengthen it. Frank Lloyd Wright called this style of architecture we know as organic geometric. He wanted, and look at how the creek flows through this space. He wanted people to feel like they were outside even when they were inside. And I think to get a true sense of it, we have to really view a tour. So I'm just going to walk you through this tour here of Falling Water, just to see what this looks like. It's beautiful. It's amazing. I hope you have an opportunity. This is no longer a private home, although it's privately owned. It is now a museum that you can tour. You could pay admission and walk through the house with a bunch of other yahoos. You know, it's not anymore just a house, but it's now a museum so that other people can enjoy this masterpiece of architecture. And it still looks very, very modern despite it being built over 70 years ago, right? 1934. You can see this is during the pandemic, wearing masks here. Examples of what we call interpenetration, that is where forms outside continue through the inside space. A beautiful combination of not only ferroconcrete, but local fieldstone that would have been sourced in the area. Kind of echoes and parallels the natural formations of the rock around it. You're surrounded by nature. You hear nature. It's a beautiful space. An idea of interpenetration there as well, with the stair treads that you can see through and around that echo the shape of the walls. Some spaces really feel like exterior spaces, but it blurs the line between interior and exterior, nature versus geometric or machine-like. This is the triumphant space here. And if you all know, this is something that we would have covered in the later chapter, but Fay Jones was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. He taught at the University of Arkansas, and Fay Jones designed Thorn Crown that you might have seen in Eureka Springs, which is a beautiful space. And you can see also principles and tenets of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. Also nearby, about 45 minutes from Batesville, there's a place called Stoneflower, which is a tiny little cabin that sort of looks like Thorn Crown, the chapel in Eureka Springs, with basically was just all glass, and you can see all the struts similar to this. And you can stay in it. My wife and I stayed in it last December as a trip, and it's just beautiful. It's amazing. It integrates a local kind of waterfall and the formation. It's just amazing. It's beautiful. But you can see kind of Frank Lloyd Wright influence here in Arkansas. Another innovative use of materials is Frank Lloyd Wright. And now, of course, we know about a really popular, pervasive building philosophy known as tiny house architecture, right? I'm going to be teaching a class in the fall. My year one seminar is actually going to be based on tiny houses, the principle of kind of a more minimalist lifestyle, living intentionally in a smaller home as opposed to making your house as big as possible. And Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the original inventors or innovators in terms of making homes smaller on purpose. Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1940s and 50s think about like post World War II. Now all of a sudden people had wealth again. It was difficult for him to get commissions in the 20s for personal reasons, but also because people during the Depression didn't have as much, expendable, disposable income. So he wasn't able to do a lot of huge commissions, and if they were more public commissions. But in the 50s, when you have a return to income and a middle class, then he's doing still a lot of wealthy commissions. And he felt like that was a bit of a travesty. He wanted to create a more utopian kind of use of architecture. And he actually had a plan called Broadacre City. It was never realized, but what he wanted to do was to create a living environment that was idealistic for people that were lower in the socioeconomic fold, right? That he wanted to integrate houses and shops, self-sufficient, prefab materials, so almost like modular, that people could build their own homes. He never realized Broadacre City, and it's never to this day been built, but it's been kind of mimicked and echoed in different housing developments, which we'll talk about with Masih Safdie. But one thing he did realize was this type of homes called Usonian. And his idea, a lot of people equate this with an idea of use, but that's a misnomer. People thought the word Usonian comes from use. It actually comes from the late 19th century. A philosopher who felt like Americans shouldn't call themselves Americans because it's in difference to Mexico and Canada, who are also part of North America. We have no right to kind of usurp their cultural identities and sovereignty. So instead, he wanted us to be called Usoni, but then he preferred the term Usonia. It kind of reminds me of Outkast, their album Stank Anya. So it's just adding Anya to US, US Anya, or Usonian, Usonia, as meaning the United States. So he's kind of picturing this new United States style architecture, very, very small on purpose to make it more affordable, but still beautiful. And this is an example of a Usonian home. It was actually built in Illinois, but moved to Crystal Bridges. So you can go visit this, you can tour this, you can go get tickets when you go to Crystal Bridges. It's free, but you just have to reserve it, and you can go through. I think during the pandemic, the inside was closed, but hopefully it's opening back up soon if it hasn't already. It's an amazing building, really, really small, but when you go in, it belies its diminutive scale. It seems open and large and expansive, even though the hallways for me are really, really tight. I'm kind of too big for this house. But it's just a really kind of evocative use of an economy of size and a single family home that would be more affordable, kind of idealistic. Instead of making homes always for the wealthiest, he wanted to start to make homes that could basically impact the social fabric in the United States. Frank Lloyd Wright. His late masterpiece is this building, the Guggenheim Museum in New York. It's on Fifth Avenue, right across from Central Park. And if you've been to New York City before, you know there's a lot of very wealthy architecture that's right along Central Park. It's a very beautiful part. Not a lot of skyscrapers along that section, more like private homes, apartments. Saks Fifth Avenue is not too far from here. Along Central Park, it is a very desirable piece of real estate. And here he plants something that looks futuristic in the 1950s. It almost looks like alien architecture, but it's beautiful, it's evocative, very organic. He wanted this to feel like one quiet, unbroken wave. This is a museum, a contemporary art museum, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, and it's basically dedicated to all the art that we've been talking about this semester. Modern art, contemporary art, and they have an amazing collection. They have some of the Kandinskys we talked about. They have some of the Constantine Brancusi pieces that we talked about, just to give you a kind of a sense of what this museum's philosophy is, and the building itself kind of echoes that philosophy and that aesthetic appeal. It has one big central band here that creates this kind of ribbon unifying effect, a really nice harmony. And this building here is dedicated to administration, and also on the top floor, it's a beautiful cafe. You can get food out here and overlook this cantilevered space, look out on Central Park. I love to go to museums and plan my day to be there as long as it takes. So you usually get there in the morning, you're going to get hungry, you're going to say, I want to get lunch. But instead of leaving to get lunch there, get a lunch in a cafe. Usually it's fairly affordable. And then you can be thinking about what you just saw in the morning and plan out what you want to see yet in the afternoon, or maybe read a brochure or look at your phone and see, is there anything that I missed? That's always my plan when I go to a museum. And if you want other tips and hints about how to explore a museum, if you know you're going to a city, hit me up before you go. I'll tell you which museums you should go to, you know, some of the highlights, some of the main pieces in the collection, what you sort of look for. Obviously, you know, you're going to be more of a expert now after taking this class, but it's always good to know kind of tips and tricks. So I'd be glad to share any of those with you. And I also want you to create a bucket list as a result of this class. So that's going to be on your test. What are the things that you want to see now as a result of this class? But this space over here on the right is actually the exhibition space. It's very, very unique. It's one big spiral. There's no floors. It's one big spiral ramp that takes you all the way. He felt like art should be viewed in this uninterrupted space, this kind of continuum of harmony and rhythm and repetition, as opposed to boxes that are closed off. Here, see, he's doing what he said was breaking out of the box. It's very inspired by the materials. This, instead of slab style construction with masonry or platforms that are created like a box using cement, here instead it's a curving form that is much more modeled or sculptural, breaks out of that volumetric form of the typical. Look at the rectangles all around it. It is really, really unusual. It's beautiful though. As you walk up to it, your view constantly changes. And I suggest to walk through Central Park and then enter from Fifth Avenue as opposed to from Central Park on the side there, the main drag, because it'll give you this changing view. It's a very beautiful viewpoint where you can cross the street and watch. I think everyone that crosses the street there does a slow motion walk because it's just an amazing structure. And he wants you to experience the artwork differently. Here I am experiencing the Guggenheim a couple summers ago. And you can see the artwork. Here's a Joan Mitchell painting, the second wave of abstract expressionists. We actually skipped that chapter, would have been the last chapter. But here you can see her work beautifully presented in this space. Now, it's a challenging space because all of the walls are curving, so they had to create these platforms where the artwork hangs in front of the wall instead of being attached to it. Now, sometimes smaller pieces are attached to it, but larger works have to be free-floating from them. But it's an amazing space, and when you get down to the top, you can look down into the space and look at where you just came from. And it also kind of gives you a sneak peek of what you're going to see on the next. It's like, oh my gosh, I can see the painting that's on the next level, the next floor. I can't think of another museum that does that same experience, right? It's really, really beautiful. Another masterpiece, a really fusion of thinking about ideas of beauty and also materials, is the architect Le Corbusier, who is actually a nickname, a pseudonym of this Swiss architect. His name is Charles Edouard Jeanneret, but he likes the nickname Le Corbusier, and this is his Villa Savoye, which is in France, about 30 miles outside of Paris. And this, again, was a home as sort of a retreat for someone to escape the city. Remember that idea we talked about, interpenetration? We see that here. His famous phrase was, a house should be a machine for living. And it actually, you drive up the driveway here, and you could make this tight turn and park your car underneath as sort of this like ceremonial entrance, like Ishtar Gate or like the gates of the Colosseum, someone coming in. Car really defines a new sense of culture and civilization in the 20th century that didn't exist before. So this house is a way of framing that experience. Interpenetration here, we can kind of see some planes that jut out, some planes that cut through. That's where we get this idea of interpenetration, as opposed to things being completely closed off and just sitting side by side or rectilinear. Think about a traditional floor plan. It usually looks like a big box with smaller boxes within it. Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright want to shatter that idea, come up with what Le Corbusier called the exploded box, that things don't have to be as dependent on a rectangle. And I love this. This is essentially like a large platform. It's like the second floor, which is the living part of this home, is raised up on these small little columns, like tiny little feet that the main structure is resting on. It's beautiful. It's a masterpiece. It's a great connection of usable space, but also beautiful appeal, aesthetics, right? A purity of those forms that you're using, and new materials like ferro concrete in this building as well. Thinking about jet architecture, plane architecture, cars, bridges, using that mechanical architecture in a way that's innovative and beautiful. That's why mid-century modern, to me, looks timeless, because it's making the best use of materials as opposed to just feeling limited by the materials, or saying we have to make architecture look this certain way because it's always looked like that. That makes, to me, things look dated, or to say it has to be Greco-Roman or classical or neoclassical or Greco-revival. All of those things will feel very dated, where I think mid-century modern starts to become timeless. You can't tell if it was built in the 1940s, the 1990s, or 2020. This is Le Corbusier's masterpiece. This is his Notre Dame des Hauts, which is in Ronchamp. It's a pilgrimage church. It's a really small chapel, but it's elegantly situated on a hilltop. So and it's again white concrete that's been molded three-dimensionally. It's also inspired, the tower on the left is inspired by the Emperor Hadrian's villa at Tivoli near Rome, where the Roman emperor was a bit of an amateur architect himself and designed his villa, his retreat. So this is kind of a take on some of those forms. So we still see traditional with expansion, traditional with experimental, but this is very beautiful. We have these perforated little windows that don't seem to have a rhyme or a reason to them. It looks like, to me, an abstract painting, thinking about modern art. This is modern architecture representing that style of modern design or abstraction. Ronchamp is really taking into consideration form and function, symbolism, all of this to create this new sort of architecture, curvilinear forms. And this is Le Corbusier's idea of exploding the box. Think outside of the box. Why does things have to be static? It looks like the sail of a ship, and even though it looks really, really large, it's actually small, and inside, all of those windows create a beautiful sense of light in this pilgrimage church. Really interesting space. It's on my bucket list. Mies van der Rohe. We talked about Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was the third director, a follower of Walter Gropius of the Bauhaus. Remember, he's famous for that mantra, less is more, which kind of suits the idea of functionalism. You don't need to make something beautiful. He comes to be synonymous with the international style. Think of all the major skyscrapers that happen that look very, very modern and sleek. That's Mies van der Rohe. And remember, he designed an early prototype of a skyscraper while he was at the Bauhaus in the 19-teens, and it never got built. Later, he and others get a chance to start building those skyscrapers. So he was 50 years, 60 years ahead of his time. But this is a really important building and shows you kind of the style. Now, a lot of people look at this architecture and say, boring, it's utilitarian, it looks too serious, austere, it doesn't have style to it. But there's a beauty in this. This is called Crown Hall. My good buddy Spencer Goff, who's a Lyon alum, he actually goes to architecture school at the Illinois Institute of Technology. This is where Mies van der Rohe and also Laszlo Moholy-Nagy taught. It's a crowning, stunning gem of an architectural space. But the idea was to build a new suitable architecture, a sort of sustainable architecture. Think about the fate of an old building for a second. A traditional building, maybe a 5-story stone building or 5-story brick building. Eventually there's going to be some rotting, some deterioration if that's wood or brick, and you might need to fix it up again. You might need to actually take off the facade. If you go downtown in a lot of main streets across the United States, every couple of decades, those buildings get new facades because they start to wear down. And what Mies van der Rohe wanted to do was create this perpetual building where, say a window breaks, boom, you pop in a new window. It hasn't changed the look of the building architecture or its footprint at all. You can expand up. You don't have to worry about, that's what sustainable architecture is all about. It creates a situation where you don't have slums anymore, where buildings maybe looked great, or this condo that just fell in Florida, where buildings maybe looked great in the 1950s or 60s or 70s, and now all of a sudden they are deteriorated, dilapidated, and you need to put a new surface on it. You need to change out a wall. Here, it's sustainable because it's essentially just metal and glass, and that would be really easy to swap out a piece of metal, swap out a piece of glass. You don't have to put a new facade on it. You don't have to change the look of it, changing with the style or changing with the times. Ironically, it hasn't always been able to keep up with that goal, though. There's been, just as many people that would feel like a building like this in an inner city could become a slum, even though this is a campus building and this is the Union where people hang out, and it has many different services under this building. But the quality of sustainability is built into the international style, as well as skyscrapers. And he finally has the ability, once he emigrates from Germany, Bauhaus is shut down, he finally gets to build his skyscrapers. These are two beautiful apartments that are on Lakeshore Drive. Lakeshore Drive in Chicago has some of the most famous and expensive architecture. There's rules about how they can place buildings so that everybody gets a view. But I love these. It's sort of like Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye with those tiny little feet that raise up the architecture. We could also see a curtain wall. That's the exterior. Remember, a curtain wall, as opposed to the traditional post and lintel architecture where the wall itself is supported by vertical struts. Here instead you have the floor above it hangs the glass on the floor below it, hence a curtain, like opening up curtains. It's a more of a sheathing than it is a wall, which is a beautiful look, but also has a very, it has tensile strength, it has a certain use in architecture. Mies van der Rohe. We start to associate this with the international style, and a lot of skyscrapers today, still, if one is built in New York City, Shanghai, in Tokyo, it's going to mimic Mies van der Rohe's ideas in the 1950s, functionalism. This is an example, too, of another building in Mies van der Rohe that starts a younger architect, Philip Johnson, who is still alive today, still making buildings. Which is interesting about this space is, if you've ever been to New York, you know how real estate is very, very congested and consolidated, and real estate is really, really expensive. So if you build a building, usually you use every square inch of the space provided. But here, what he's done is created this large plaza space to get that idea of inner penetration as well, so that the first floor feels open. And look at, again, like the Villa Savoye little feet that the building is standing on creates a sense of openness, which we can see here as well. Really, really beautiful building, but bronze and amber windows to give a sense of decoration. So it's functionalism, but it still is aesthetic. I think this is a gem of a building. Some people would walk right by this and say, it's a skyscraper. It's so innovative, and look at how different it is by the buildings around it, right? So this is Mies van der Rohe and Philip Johnson, and this is an example of domestic architecture that Philip Johnson did, very innovative architect, and when he struck out on his own after being a partner and a student of Mies van der Rohe, he starts to do things like this, which looks indebted to Mies van der Rohe and his ideas of interpenetration, open space. We saw that German pavilion building that he had done in Barcelona that had open spaces. But this is just a really, I can't imagine living in this. Probably the curtains would be drawn all the time. An entirely glass house, but it has that idea of kind of industrial versus organic, because you can be inside and outside at the same time. You have uninterrupted, open interior spaces. Basically, these architects, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Frank Lloyd Wright, Philip Johnson, they came up with open concept before open concept was really even a thing. Open sight lines to be able to see from room to room, have conversations across the building. It's a more freeing space. Another radical architect at this time that did his own kind of thing was this Finnish architect, Alvar Aalto, and his buildings were using brick. He wanted to free the materials from its past purpose. So a lot of times people think of bricks as just being something modular that you can build rectangles or geometric cubes, but here he expands outside of that and does really beautiful sculptural forms. This is a church in Real, Italy that I love to show because here he designed the chair, here he designed the church, and they have much more sense of freedom, openness, rhythm, and organic qualities. This looks like a natural form, like a plant, as opposed to a building, which is beautiful about it. With the ideas of new forms, one of the last buildings that I want to show you is this Sydney Opera House, right? So it's a functional space, but it's also a beautiful space, exploiting and exploring new forms, these like concentric, almost like nesting dolls of turtle shell-like shapes encompassing one or the other. And you can see how it creates with this windows here a sense of light and porousness inside of this. And it's innovative and it's a landmark. Cities were interested now in creating tourist locations, like wanting to be able to go. Perhaps the Sydney Opera House is on your bucket list. That's intentional, right? That's saying that we're innovative and you want to see something creative, cutting edge, you're going to have to come to Sydney, Australia to see it. But artists and architects during this time were exploring both modern forms and traditional forms as well. And one of the best examples of that is the Japanese architect Kenzo Tange. And I love his work because it really is very, very new and modern. It looks like brutalism, which we talked about before, which is poured concrete, very brutal in the sense of just raw. Not brutal in the sense of like garish or ugly, but he also incorporated traditional Japanese like temple architecture. So it's kind of old and new in a beautiful way. It's functional. This was for a space, like a performance space for gymnastics, which creates a unique problem of how do you create a large space but still make it visually interesting. It suits its purpose, but it also looks very, very beautiful. We talked about Frank Lloyd Wright and his Usonian homes. Moshe Safdie continued that. He is a Israeli-Canadian Jewish architect who was interested in making homes more affordable. But typically when people make like housing developments, for instance, and it's for people that are of lower economic means, they're often not thinking about the same thing if they were building something for a private, wealthy donor. In other words, Frank Lloyd Wright felt like when he was making something for Falling Water as an architect, other architects would have gave that person the cream of the crop, probably not used concrete, and then when they made a home for like a housing development, for lower economic areas, they would use concrete there, or they would use very simple things, block-like, and not worry about giving people the same access to, say, nature. Moshe Safdie continues and expands on the idea of Frank Lloyd Wright and wanted to create modular prefab homes. Like right now, there's some really innovative things that are happening. People are 3D printing homes, like literally in Africa. You can, if you have a printer, you can print the little blocks and modules. You can't make the windows and the doors, but pretty much everything else. That is sustainable architecture. That's using materials in an innovative way. But this design by the Israeli architect Moshe Safdie called Habitat 67 because it was built in 1967 for the Expo 67 in Montreal, Canada, which was a huge deal at the time. It was seen as very, very cutting edge. The structure, but also the World's Fair, is like, look at where we've come, humanity, and look at all these futuristic developments that we can do. But what it did was it opened things up. There's a sense of equality. Even though you maybe come from lower means, do you not deserve a garden? Do you not deserve an outdoor space that someone who's wealthy might already have the luxury of a large yard? So all of these are stair-stepped and separated, so you have a distance from your neighbors, and everybody has their own terrace and their own garden as well. It's a beautiful space. It looks very futuristic. I think people saw this in the 60s and said, God, I hope buildings don't look like this in the future. This is scary. This is ominous. This looks like dystopian architecture. But I think other people looked at it then, like I look at it now, and say, God, I hope the buildings of the future look like this, because this is amazing. This is dope. I would live here. This is sweet. It still exists. You can see this in person. People still live here. It's a great idealistic idea of what architecture could and should be, to get a sense of sustainability and unity in terms of equality amongst the classes. Mashy Safdie also, of course, designed a building in our own backyard. Crystal Bridges was designed by the architect Mashy Safdie, who also did this very famous Habitat 67, y'all. So this isn't in the book, but I love this. Very innovative, and it takes into consideration, it's nestled in this kind of nature-like landscape, the woods around it, the pond that's in the middle of it. It's meant to look like turtles emerging from a pond. It's beautiful architecture. And just like Frank Lloyd Wright, it was considering how to show off, how to highlight the artwork that's inside of it. Here you can see is the cafe. Over here is, actually this is a lecture hall. This is the cafe here. These are all exhibition wings. Beautiful sense of inside and outside interpenetration as well. The last that we'll talk about is good old Bucky, aka Buckminster Fuller. His name is actually Richard Buckminster Fuller. He gets the nickname Bucky, and people nickname these Bucky balls. It doesn't say that in the book, but he nicknamed them Dymaxion houses, which is based on three ideas. Dymaxion is derived from three terms: dynamic, maximum, tension. So the dy comes from dynamic, the max comes from maximum, and the ion comes from tension. And what he's doing here is he's using the format of building planes and using that to make homes. And basically what he was able to do is make a self-sufficient enclosed space, a sort of environmental valve. If you think about like Biodome that's out in the Southwest, it's creating a safety net for the community that lives inside of it. But it's also created geodesic dome architecture, which Buckminster Fuller is very well known for doing. It's interesting because he was sort of self-taught. He thought there were solutions that were just at our fingertips, that instead of pursuing the most rational way, thinking about aligning engineers and architects and mathematicians and designers and artists to create the best space possible, advancing all of those. And this is actually called the Fly's Eye Dome, and it's at Crystal Bridges, which is pretty cool. Crystal Bridges has so many heavy hitter things from modern art and this semester that we're fortunate to be able to go see. Let me catch my breath. Next chapter, conceptual and activist art. So in the 1970s, some artists start to talk about how the idea is more important than the end result, i.e. the most important aspect of the work is the thought that goes into the work, okay? So the intention, the thought, the concept in a way is more important than how the visual, how it looks, which is kind of like Duchamp, because remember Duchamp was anti-retinal art. And so these artists really build on the principles of Duchamp and Dada, but really think about, and there was a movement called art and language. And the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, in 1970, had an exhibition called Information. So the late 60s, early 70s are the kind of proto-conceptual art period. It becomes much more popular later 70s, but here's an early example of something that we would consider conceptual art, where the idea is more important than, say, the execution of it or how it looks. This is based on Plato's Republic, which he said there were sort of degradations of an idea. There was first the idea of something, then there is there's the thing itself, which is a degradation of that idea, which is a translation of idea. Then lastly, there is a picture of that idea, which is the furthest thing from the actual thing or idea. It's another degradation. So in terms of Plato and his ideal republic, he would say the republic would be better off without artists. So Joseph Kosuth, who's actually an artist originally from Toledo, Ohio, a U.S. artist, he was exploring the concept, the idea of the purity of ideas and thoughts and intentionality as opposed to what the work looks like. We don't worry about if it's beautiful or decorative anymore. It's more the idea. So here he shows us 3 chairs. He has a photocopy of a definition of the chair, which is sort of the idea of a chair, and according to Plato would be the most pure distillation of an actual object, because Plato described a couch, the idea of a couch, the couch that you could sit in, and then a painting of the couch. The idea of the couch was the purest idea, ideation or variation of it. The couch itself was a degradation of the idea of a couch, and a picture of a couch was the furthest from the truth, the Platonic ideal, which is really, really interesting. And so here we see 3 chairs that are also all a version of these ideas. It also points to a branch of critical theory relating to semiotics, and that is how signs, the study of signs and how they produce meaning, which we've talked about before with Magritte's work, with the "This is not a pipe," the betrayal of images. If you think about the idea, that's the signified, right? In this case, it's the definition of the chair. Then there is the specific symbol. In this case, the sign would be the chair, right? So you have the sign, the signifier, how you explore that idea, which is the signified. Ultimately, in the book, thinks about an example of dog. If I say the word dog, it doesn't have meaning until it connects to someone. And if I say dog, the dog, the word is the signifier. The sign is only going to work. An English-speaking person, when they hear the word dog, another English-speaking person is going to immediately connect that signifier with the idea of an actual dog, maybe your pet that wags its tail, that you can pet and jumps up on you when you get home. But that's going to be different for every single person. So you have the sign, the signifier, and the signified, the idea. And it's difficult. These only work when the sign and the signifier work hand in hand. So an interesting piece, long explanation to basically say, what is the real chair? Is it this? No, this is just one chair. There are other chairs. Chair could be a stool. It could be tall. It could be comfortable. It doesn't have to be just this chair. Is this the chair? No, that's the definition of a chair. I can't sit in that. Is this a chair? No, that's a two-dimensional reproduction of a chair, right? And you can see how there's slippage between those. Another conceptual artist who becomes very, very influential, actually, I have some friends who went to Cal Art. He taught at the very famous Cal Art school. John Baldessari had a very famous class that he called critiquing strategies, where they just had basically long, dragged out critiques that could last all day, that were these just like monumental events. But his work is also very conceptual. The idea is more important than the way that it looks, although when I see John Baldessari's work, I think it's also very, very beautiful. He would link different photographs that seemingly have no connection, and he would make a connection between them. Oftentimes, the only intervention he would do to them is to juxtapose them together, and then also paint shapes over top of them. For instance, this yellow circle, this blue circle here, or highlighting this hand and making it green. And here it has a title called Heel, which a way of an entrance point, a title as an entrance point, it gets us to think about what is going on here. So heel perhaps relates to Achilles' heel, right? Thinking about the idea of that vulnerability, the Greek hero Achilles being dipped but held by his heel, so that was his weak point, right? The point that wasn't protected. And so here we see heels. Here we see the paw of a dog, but also maybe thinking about healing. Here it looks like changing a tire, this is healing it in a way. Some people describe a bread, the loaf of bread, the end of it as being a heel. But also, he could be thinking about, we know he had been reading Elias Canetta's book, Crowds and Power, on the relationship between the crowd, the power of the collective versus the power of the individual. And by superimposing a red line here on these individuals, he's showing the weakness of a group is those members who peel off, right? So an interesting juxtaposition of ideas where the concept is more important than necessarily the way that it works. One of my favorite conceptual artists is the Belgian artist Marcel Broodthaers. Broodthaers was a poet who was inspired by pop art, but wanted to make art that was more poetic. So he's kind of like using the language of pop artists, but also being sort of critical of them, and also using another Belgian artist that played around with imagery and the surrealist aspects of imagery. Who is that? Belgian artist, surrealist, played around with how images are understood. Rene Magritte, right? And here, I love this piece. These are glass jars with magazine reproductions of an eyeball. And a lot of times, he saw his works as kind of new version of surrealism, conceptual, visual carrying out of his poetic ideas. Really interesting. And he saw these as poems. These are visual poems. So instead of having to write a poem, you could make a poem. Moving in to another aspect of conceptualism, and that is mining the museum, right? This is a very famous piece by Fred Wilson named Mining the Museum, where he was invited to give an exhibition at a contemporary museum in Baltimore. And instead of making anything new, which he did not do, in a very Duchampian way, he actually just reframed pieces that were already in the collection at this particular museum. And here he's making a cultural critique. In this museum's collection, they had fine pieces of metal silverwork, which we can see here. And it's dated, right? 1793 to 1880. What's significant about those dates? That's also when slavery is legal in the United States, right? So here we see shackles. This was also in the museum's collection of an enslaved person. So this would have been a black enslaved person that was shackled. And this is something the museum owned. And here Fred Wilson, who's an African-American black artist, making a connection between perhaps the people who would have used, we don't know for sure, and the museum didn't know for sure, but perhaps the people who were serving, the people who owned these, were the same people that perhaps were wearing these shackles, that were enslaved. So it's a cultural critique, it's a critique of the institution, and it's making us think about the implication of these objects. In other words, if this museum had on display silverwork and had this in one particular wing, and we come up and we look at it and we say, look at the craftsmanship, look at the beauty of this. But maybe we're forgetting at the same time the person that made that, created that, could have also created this. A blacksmith is the same thing as a silversmith, right? And the person that perhaps owned this also owned these, and also enslaved people and treated them like possessions, right? It's an important understanding of the history that we've gone through, but the history of these objects as well, and a story that's difficult to tell that sometimes museums stray away from. I was at Yale a couple years ago and did a fellowship there, and Eloy Yale was the founder of Yale, and for the longest time Yale said that he didn't own slaves. They own and have enslaved people. It's later been proven that in fact he did. He made his livelihood off of trade. And most people, early settlers to the United States, if they were making money off of trade, they also had enslaved people themselves. And there was a painting of Eloy Yale and a family that he was close with, that he was trading with, and in the painting was a young black enslaved person. And that painting had been hidden since like the 1970s. They said this is something that we don't want to associate at the Yale Museum of Art. But recent grad students, and this relates to critical race theory, and people are saying, "Oh, I don't want that taught. It's teaching people to hate whites, and it's divisive." No, it's just using history as a way of understanding what the reality was, and instead of hiding it away, it's saying this is the reality. How do we move on? How do we make sure that systemic racism isn't still an issue? How do we move forward, right? And the graduate students at the time said they found the painting, they looked at it, they wrote about it, and they asked Yale to put it back up, to put it into context, to say this is where Yale came from, right? And I'm not saying they were glorifying it. They were basically questioning the critical institution that wanted to hide that away, right? It's something that we have to deal with this reality, face this reality to be able to learn from it. Another really interesting conceptual artist and early performance artist is Nam June Paik. Nam June Paik used performance art. He was interested also in electronic music. He was a musician, and he collaborated with musicians. This piece is called TV Bra. It was for his Living Sculpture series where he would have musicians wear outfits. In this case, the bra covers her breasts, and in the bra has TV sets that were broadcasting shows, TV. And it's kind of, well, first of all, it's a take on, people used to call television sets the boob tube because they had analog tubes inside of them. A nickname for those tubes were boob tubes. It has nothing to do with breasts. But another nickname for breasts is boob. So here it's a conflation, it's a connection between those two things. But also oftentimes in TV, there's a sort of objectification of women. So in a way, when you're looking here, you're not hearing the music, you're being distracted. He was arrested for one of his performances where there was nudity. So it's interesting. Another really famous, and he did pieces like this, that you can actually see this piece at Crystal Bridges, using television monitors, computer screens, etc., to create a new sense of kind of new media, and not just art that has to be painting or sculpture, but it can be using technology to an interesting thing. This guy looks like a man or a robot built of these different TV screens, and each monitor would be playing images that Nam June Paik had designed himself. My favorite performance artist, and one that I think is really interesting to study, who's still alive, still working, was very innovative in the late 60s, early 70s, continues to make performance art to this day. She recently had a huge retrospective of her work in New York at the MoMA called The Artist is Present, which I'm going to show you a clip from. But this is her and her partner. So she is an artist that was originally, she was born in Yugoslavia, where the communist government controlled cultural activities, which is like former Eastern Soviet bloc countries couldn't be creative, experimental. They had to kind of be accepted and their art championed by the state or not. It was banned. And so she was aware of things that would have been suppressed culturally. And also her partner, Ule, who's shown here, who recently passed away about, I want to say a year ago or 2 years ago, his upbringing in post-World War II Germany would have made him aware of the consequences of a government, right, suppressing ideas and government censorship. They collaborated a lot of times. It was Marina Abramovich and Ule. This is a brilliant piece. Now you might look at this and say, how is this art? Well, it's performance art. It's not quite a play. It's not a static painting, but it's kind of a combination of the two of those things. The piece is called Rest Energy. They both wore similar outfits. He's in dark colored slacks. She's in a dark colored skirt. They're both wearing white shirts. And what they did was they held this bow and arrow with the arrow actually trained at her heart. It's meant to be a statement on romantic couples and the power, the tension the two of them have. You have to trust each other, right? And so what they would do is they would take breaks, rest energy. There's the tension of that arrow at rest. It can't go anywhere, but when you pull it back, it could spring in, and she has to trust Ule, her partner, otherwise it could hit her in the chest. And they would lean apart from one another, and that bow would stretch out. And she said even though she did paint pieces that were very dangerous to her, she said this was the one where she felt the most uncomfortable. Which I want to show you two of her pieces. I'm going to show you videos of two of her pieces. The first one is called Imponderabilia, and this was a piece where
each other. The public entering the museum have to pass sideways through the small space between us.
she had herself and Ulay both nude, side by side in a narrow hallway, and viewers of this piece had to pass through the two of them in 1977 nude in the museum. Imponderabilia.
Each person passing has to choose which one of us to face.
Ulay's on the right, Marina Abramovich is on the left. And you can watch the people's faces as this is sort of like an uncomfortable thing. And some people have a tough time squeezing through. They have to, and then they kind of look where they just came from. They have to make a choice. Do I rub up against him? Do I rub up against her? Brilliant piece. Uses the body as art. In a way, the body, instead of being a figurative painting, the body itself is a sculpture. How would you feel walking through this piece? How would you feel seeing this piece? And what kind of questions about gender arise because of this piece as well? What does it mean to be a male participant, a female participant? How does Ulay feel during this piece? How does Marina Abramovich feel during this piece? And another piece that I want to show you that I think is just brilliant is in 2010 at the MoMA, Marina Abramovich recast all of her pieces that she had done, all these performance pieces throughout her history, her career, including Imponderabilia, which she recreated with actors instead of herself. But she also made a new piece called The Artist is Present, where she would sit for a set amount of time without showing any emotion, without talking, and just looking at the person and across from her. So you as a viewer, as an audience member, could, and people lined up all day, every day. This show was sold out. People lined up, and they just wanted to experience this and sit there for 5 minutes, just uninterrupted. And people didn't think that it would have such an emotional effect on them, but it did. And one thing that's interesting is Marina Abramovich and Ulay broke up, and they hadn't seen each other in over like a decade or something. And they reunited. He came and sat and became part of this piece. The Artist is Present. So you can see other people waiting in line and then go and take their turn staring at the small table across, looking at Marina Abramovich. And this is also considered an endurance piece, a performance piece, where she literally sits there all day, uninterrupted, just staring at people, right? It's a piece that not the average person could do. It's such a physical feat. She has to be in really tip-top shape. You should watch the documentary The Artist is Present, because it talks about this piece, but it talks about Marina Abramovich's career. And so I want to just show you a bit of this. This is the piece The Artist is Present, and at the end we see when she is reunited with her former lover, partner, and artist collaborator, Ulay. Here's Ulay. They haven't seen each other in years. It's the first time she broke character too the entire time. She did this for weeks. If you don't feel something there, I don't know. I worry about you. You might not be human. That's just so powerful and visceral and effective. Just amazing piece and amazing experience. Marina Abramovich and her partner Ule, the artist is present from 2010. Chris Burden, interesting, thinking about the artist using their body as art, as a sort of living sculpture. Talked about this last time. Chris Burden had himself shot in his left arm by a friend. The artist commented at 7:45 p.m. I was shot in the left arm by a friend. The bullet was a Copper Jacket 22 long rifle. My friend was standing about 15 feet from me. He did this in November in a gallery in California in 1971. He did a lot of performance pieces that actually endangered his life. He stood in a gallery 15 feet away from his friend and had him shoot him in his arm with his arm held out like this against the wall. And you can see this is the aftermath. This is a photo, but it's documenting the actual performance. Here we can see his friend in the gallery shooting him. He actually got scared and nervous. He was taking performance art to its extreme, right? Certainly, Marina Abramovich did pieces that were dangerous. She had things around her, invited people to use those. She was very scared for her safety. You know, someone could have picked up a knife and harmed her. She did a piece where she cut herself intentionally with a knife. And Chris Burden here is taking it to the extreme, having himself shot. It's very ironic, though, because he did a lot of body art. He even, for one of his exhibitions, he laid out in the street, in the gallery, as it was getting dark, laying down, just hoping that traffic would miss him and avoid him, which is very, very trusting. He realized at any point his friend could have killed him. The cars could have killed him. And he ironically stopped doing this type of artwork because he was not worried more for his own safety, but saying someone is literally going to take this to the extreme and kill themselves. And he didn't really want to see that happen. So he stopped doing body art. It was a very influential piece, very famous piece. I think it's very ironic today. Most of what he makes is art that's related to toys and very playful and peaceful, but that still represents the idea of a potential for violence. In this case, all of the submarines in the United States of America throughout history, right? 625 miniature cardboard submarines. So it's still that kind of violent threat, but it's suspended them in this kind of peaceful transition, a frozen moment in time. And he lists them all. So there's still the potential for violence, but it's much more playful, right? A very important female feminist art group is called the Feminist Art Program, co-founded by Miriam Shapiro and the famous artist Judy Chicago, who wasn't named Judy Chicago. She was poking fun at the artist Robert Indiana as a sort of masculine gesture of like taking on a name of a location. So she takes on the name Judy Chicago. And the Feminist Art Program created this house that they nicknamed Woman House, which had different ideas of how females had been viewed throughout history and wanted to, in a shocking way, confront their viewer, mostly a male audience, in thinking about the kind of hidden realities. For instance, they had a bathroom piece that was about their menstrual cycle, for instance. A white, pristine bathroom and then an overflowing garbage can with feminine products as a juxtaposition, a huge contrast between what we see and what's kind of behind the scenes, what's hidden. And this famous piece here, which was part of Woman House, this very large-scale interactive art exhibition of a woman, this mannequin trapped in a linen closet that's perpetually trapped and associated with this domesticated idea of the role of say, a woman doing laundry or ironing linen. Here, to say that we shouldn't be trapped or confined by just these limited roles. And Judy Chicago's most famous piece is this piece called The Dinner Party, which is a take on The Last Supper, which is very famously 13 dudes, right? So this instead is a famous dinner of 39 women, and each setting represents a different historical prominent woman like Artemisia Gentileschi, Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, and others. It also has 999 signatures inside on the tile floor. Also very important women throughout history, not just art history, but history and signatures, as a very pro-feminist way of saying these are the women that are prominent that have made things happen. Now it's a kind of a controversial piece though too, because it still does define women by place and placemaking and place settings. And also, you remember we think about Georgia O'Keeffe, who did the very famous flower paintings that dudes, art critics, would try to mansplain and say, oh, they were about female anatomy, and that pissed off Georgia O'Keeffe. She said they were really never about that, even though people kind of read into them. Well, here Judy Chicago takes that idea and amplifies it. Literally every single dinner plate is a vagina, and it's kind of like a pro-yonic as opposed to a pro-phallic symbol of matriarchy versus patriarchy. And so here's an example. This is huge, by the way. Each side is about 48 feet. Recently, the Brooklyn Museum now made this on view permanently. They said this is such an important piece of art history and a prominent masterpiece by Judy Chicago that they've committed to exhibiting it there forever in this space. But here is zooming in. What's interesting about this too is it took a lot of crafts women to make this. So she collaborated. She didn't just make this piece herself. She had people make the plates, ceramicists make the plates, textile artists make the tablecloths that had very visual interpretations of the person. This, for instance, is Natalie Barney. We talked about Natalie Barney in an earlier chapter as being the partner of the artist, the feminist lesbian artist, Romaine Brooks. And so here we see her. Then Natalie Clifford Barney was a poet, and we can see kind of interpretation of some of her themes and her plate. And really, really interesting work. Actually, when I was in grad school, had the opportunity to meet Judy Chicago because she came as a super professor and worked with students for a semester. She got to handpick her class though, and she chose only women, which understandably makes a lot of sense for her ideals and her philosophies. But she worked with those graduate students in making a piece, and so it was really cool. I got to meet her and talk with her. But for a lot of those students, it was a really powerful experience to be able to work with her, and they become part of the piece as well. Like you can see, it's not just her; it's all of these women that are making this piece with her, and that this piece is about. It's a brilliant piece, really, really beautiful. Another really interesting feminist art movement is Guerrilla Girls. Guerrilla Girls is a take on the word gorilla. They would wear gorilla masks, but also gorilla in the sense of like a really pro right activist kind of idea, like guerrilla warfare, being very progressive. And they were anonymous, with the exception of their spokesperson. These were actually female artists that hid their identities and would do rallies and protests outside of museums and cultural spaces, similar to Fred Wilson, a cultural critique, a critique of institutions, and the fact that at this time, and still to this day actually, more men were being exhibited. One of their famous billboards was, how do you get into the Met Museum if you're a woman? You have to be naked, right? Because there's more paintings of female nudes than there are actually female. There's only 4% at that time of the modern art section was women, but 76% of the paintings were of female. That seems ironic, right? That's a bit of a split. How does that make you feel? That's a bit of a disconnect, right? And so here we see two of the Guerrilla Girls protesting this, and this is a famous painting by Ong. I love it, the Grand Odalisque that they cover in a gorilla mask as well. This was one of their phrases. A lot of times people, I have a friend who's a professor at another school, and she has this hanging on her door, her office door. The advantages of being a woman artist, and kind of these are tongue-in-cheek, obviously. Working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world, and your your 4 freelance jobs, right? The only way to get your picture in an art magazine is wearing a gorilla suit. They're being critical of the institutions at the time that were very sexist, racist, and still to this day. There's a lot of people continuing this work. Museums, by their nature, are racist and sexist. Here's an example of one of their pieces that they considered as propaganda, but also art. They would exhibit these. And how many women had one-person exhibitions at New York City museums last year? Here's the 4 major museums, only 1. So that means out of the other sort of 50 shows, 49 out of 50 of them were male artists, right? And this is, Guerrilla Girls still continue this work today. This was a piece from just a few years ago, 2018, and it said, in 1999, when they first originally did this, the U.S. Senate, which didn't have many women, was still more progressive than Hollywood. They had 9% of the senators, which there are 100 senators, 2 for each state, only 9 female senators. And now in Hollywood, there was 4% of the directors in Hollywood were female, right? So if you thought about 100 directors, 96 of them are going to be dudes, 4 of them are going to be women. Now, and this is still an issue to this day, right? If you think about the Oscars, now it's still worse than the U.S. Senate. Now, and this was in 2018, there were 25 female senators out of 100, but still only 4% female directors. Same issue with architecture, right? There's very few. Zaha Hadid is a great female architect, but in a small class. It's mostly male. Another feminist artist, Janine Antoni. I love her work. It's really interesting. When you first walk into this gallery, we're presenting with this 2 large cubes that you just see as massive sculptures, 1 brown, 1 white. But when you read the title, it's called Na. And then when you see the materials on the sheet, you realize 1 is a 600 cube of chocolate that's been gnawed by the artist as like a performance. They literally took bites out of the piece of chocolate. And the other one is lard that the artist took bites of. And it's kind of a take on the idea of bulimia, which traditionally, statistically, has affected women more than men. And it's a piece about body issues as well. This isn't in the book, but I think this is her most brilliant piece. I love this. It's called Lick and Lather. It's traditional in one sense because they're female busts, which is something we've seen throughout art history, but they're atypical in the sense of the materials they are made out of. The one on the left is, it's a self-portrait of Janine Antoni, and it is on the left chocolate, her own self-portrait, her likeness, and on the right soap. And what she did was she licked the one on the left, the one that made of chocolate, to kind of erode and deteriorate, just like a Roman bust, how it might look today. And the one on the right is soap, and she literally took a bath with this big, huge bust and rubbed it on herself to kind of blur the lines, just like a Roman imperial bust that over the course of time has been worn away or maybe lost to history. So a really interesting take. Also on materials, just like a Freudian interpretation of chocolate representing something sexual, but also something base, like having to do with fecal material. What's the positive way of saying pooping? What's the good word for saying poop? Like a bowel movement or something, right? So it's like a take. It's a take on like pure things that are appealing but also repulsive at the same time. Or thinking about soap. When soap starts, it's beautiful and pure and clean, but once you've used it, it kind of gets dirty. Kind of play on like, yo, what's up, Corey?
Hey, what's up?
Hey, how you doing?
Good. Should start my sword off.
I'm teaching. Let me see it. Can I see it? One of the I know I told y'all today's lecture would be short, but I don't think it's any shorter. It's our last one though. I'm getting excited. Yo, that's dope. That's so cool. That looks amazing. How'd you do that?
I did it,
Digital?
digital, and then I pasted it on with Mod Podge. And then
Come show my group. I'm sure they would dig this. This is Corey Bauer. She graduated from Lyon College in
Where's the
2014.
camera? Oh, hi.
Look, isn't that fresh? She made this. Come check out the skateboard exhibition at the Arts Council. It's a fundraiser for building a skate park. Yo, do it.
Yeah.
All right, so an important African American art organization was called OBA-C, even though it's OBAC. They stressed the OBA, which is a Yoruba word meaning leader or ruler. And OBA-C was the Organization of Black American Culture. And one of the first things they did was this Wall of Respect in Chicago. That's sort of a renewal of murals that kind of died out. Remember we talked about the Grand Three, Cisqueiros and Orozco and Diego Rivera, the famous spouse of Frida Kahlo. But it kind of died out, and it hadn't been seen in inner cities. So this is a really new, powerful thing, the Wall of Respect in 1967. And one of the artists that co-founded this group was actually Jeff Donaldson, who's from Arkansas. He's from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He later moves to Chicago and starts what he calls Afro Cobra, which still exists to this day. It's the longest lasting artist collective ever to exist in history. Think about the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionism. They had finite time periods. Afro Cobra has existed longer than any of those because they've lasted since the late 1960s, continue to this day. A loose affiliation of black artists, and Afro Cobra is a take on Cobra, which we learned about those artists, Copenhagen, Brussels, Amsterdam, and here it's Afro Cobra, which is a moniker that Jeff Donaldson was one of these founders, as well as Wadsworth Jarrell. That Afro Cobra stands for African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, to get that moniker of Afro Cobra. It's interesting, it's beautiful. They wanted to do something similar to the Black Panther, something that was very pro-black, but also kind of militaristic, antagonistic, in your face. And this Wall of Respect also was very equalitarian. It was like about a democracy of black artists that got together and picked who they thought were influential black leaders. Like you can see Charlie Parker here, you can see Malcolm X here, and other important black leaders. They wanted to put and important black cultural icons. They wanted to change the name of the game. They said, we don't have black heroes, or white America doesn't show our black heroes, so we're going to show them ourselves to each other. There's an interesting article about this piece, The Wall of Respect, and a guy came down from Ebony Magazine and he interviewed some people that helped out with it, some people in the community, and how they felt about it. And one guy was just literally leaning against the wall in 1967, and he said, what are you doing? What are you doing here? And he said, sometimes I just need to get my strength by leaning on this wall, the Wall of Respect, because it's empowering. It had a short fate, unfortunately. It attracted not only positive attention, but also some negative attention. There was some violence in this area, and part of it was damaged. So the city thought that it was getting too much negative attention, and they tore it down. But one of the things that it did, you can really see this in the United States to this day, Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd murals that I have two students that are studying right now in Minneapolis, the Black Lives Matter murals that happened last summer in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., right outside the White House, in New York City, painting Black Lives Matter, really, really huge. Murals being a way of empowering, making social, political, and racial justice possible, right? And this starts with this very important piece. And I think it's a travesty that Jeff Donaldson gets one mention. And how does he get a mention? Just his name being associated with Afro Cobra. Is that intentional? I don't know. Seems to me like it could be a bit racist. I think you could have pages dedicated to Jeff Donaldson and his work. This is his work. It's beautiful. It's really interesting. It's about kind of looking back and looking forward, this new kind of focus on pride of being African in lineage and being a black artist in the United States, using metaphors and symbolism from Egypt, Egyptology, Egypt culture, African culture, and but also contemporary ideas from the 1960s. A lot of major museums collect his pieces. He's no longer living. He passed away a few years ago. But if you go to the Arts and Science Center in Pine Bluff, They have a few of his pieces, and they have a great collection. I've actually had an opportunity to study behind the scenes some of the important pieces by Jeff Donaldson and Barbara Jones in their collection, because they have an amazing collection of Black art and African American art history in their work. So I encourage you to make a trek down there. Peace. My apologies for running long. Last lecture. Hope you enjoyed. I've enjoyed teaching y'all and doing the modern art this semester. Good luck on your last test. You've got this. Peace out.